Welcome to Kingdoms in Conflict. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Wallace. Can science point us to God? Can the nemesis of the church for the past 2 centuries now be recognizing the existence of a creator? Dr. Stephen Meyer, the director of the Center for Science and Culture for the Discovery Institute and an acclaimed author, will be with us to discuss his recent book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. This interview is the first of a 2-part series. We will discuss his new book and more when we return. Welcome to Kingdoms in Conflict. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Wallace. We're privileged to have with us today Dr. Stephen Meyer. How are you doing today, sir?
Very well, Eric, and thank you for having me on.
It's our pleasure. I've been kind of following the Discovery Institute, and I want to say it's Discovery Institute, not the Discovery Channel. So the Discovery Institute for quite some time. And, you know, we've had your Dr. John West on. In fact, he was our first interview, by the way. So we were talking about scientific racism at the time.
He told me about you guys and the conversation you'd had. Yeah, very good.
Yeah, it was great. It was great. You're here, though, to talk about I know you've written some other books like Signature in the Cell, Darwin's Doubt, and even we're an editor, I believe, with Theistic Evolution. But we want to look at your book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. Actually, when I read the title, it made me think about, Star Wars film, The Return of the Jedi. And I was wondering, should I wait for the movie to come out or what? But I don't mean to.
Interestingly, theatrical release documentary is actually being made and is in production about the film, or about the book. So we hope to have that released sometime next year, early 2023.
What is the overall premise of the book?
Well, the premise of the book is that scientific discoveries actually point to the reality of God. We have all heard very powerful voices in the culture telling us that science properly understood undermines belief in God, and that therefore science and faith are in some sort of conflict. And another view is that science and faith in God occupy completely separate realms of inquiry. This was the view that was advanced by the late Stephen Jay Gould. And he described that as NOMA, short for non-overlapping magisteria. Science has its realm of facts, faith is concerned with values and beliefs, and ne'er the twain shall meet. The book that I've written is advancing a third and different view, and that is that science properly understood is sometimes theologically neutral, sometimes philosophically neutral, but science has also made many important discoveries that have decidedly theistic implications. They provide support, evidential support for theistic belief, for belief in God. And so the book, Return of the God Hypothesis, is telling the story of how scientists once thought of the relationship between science and faith in exactly those terms. During a period known as the Scientific Revolution, the early scientists thought that science, properly understood, was revealing the glory of God. There's a great historian of science at Baylor University, Rodney Stark, who published a book with Princeton University Press titled For the Glory of God, describing the basis of the scientific revolution, and that many of the early scientists thought they were, in fact, by studying nature, revealing God's handiwork. We've lost that perspective. We lost it in the 19th century, the late 19th century. But in the book, I argue that there have been 3 great discoveries over the last 100 years, scientific discoveries, that should be bringing it back, and are, for a growing minority of scientists, bringing back that perspective that nature is actually revelatory of the reality of a creator, of a transcendent mind who acts in the creation, also known as God.
So you actually answer that question, can science point us to God? And your answer is actually yes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
And you mentioned, and I have read your book, by the way. You mentioned that, the 3 discoveries, and I believe I have them down as the universe has a beginning, or had a beginning, that the universe is fine-tuned for life, and that there are periods of new information, biologically, periods of new information that need to be explained, and it can't be necessarily explained from a materialist point of view.
Well, right. And that third discovery is perhaps most striking, that inside the first living cells, even the simplest living cells, we've discovered an exquisite realm of information and informational and nanotechnology. The DNA molecule contains information in a digital form. It contains instructions for building the proteins and protein machines that help keep cells alive. It's also part of a larger information storage, transmission, and processing system. And then within the cell, you also have exquisite nano machines, tiny, tiny little rotary engines, sliding clamps, robotic walking motor proteins. It's extraordinary. No one had any idea that the quote unquote simple cell, as it was described in the late 19th century, would turn out to be so complex in an integrated and informational way.
The whole idea about the universe has a beginning, how did that come about? I mean, who helped us make that discovery?
Yeah, that was first discovered in the 19 teens and 20s, or the first indications of what first was recognized, indications of an expanding universe, that the light coming from distant galaxies was being stretched out, that the wavelengths were being stretched out. So your viewers may be familiar with a Doppler shift. If you have a train that has a whistle on it and it recedes from you down the track, the pitch of the sound of that train whistle will drop. It will become lower. And that's because at a deeper level, the wavelengths of sound are being stretched out and our ears hear that as a lower pitch. The same thing happens in light. If an object is receding away from us, the light waves are stretched out and they then look redder than they should otherwise look. Red light has longer wavelength, violet has shorter wavelength. And so the light coming from the distant galaxies looked redder than it should look if the galaxies were stationary in their relationship to us, suggesting that they weren't stationary, that they were actually receding like that train down the train tracks. But if that's happening in every direction of the night sky, and this is what was discovered from the 1920s onward, that in every quadrant of the night sky, we were finding galaxies that were projecting light that was red shifted, galaxies that were receding away from us. That suggests a universe which is actually expanding in something like a spherically symmetric way, like a balloon. And one of the other things that supported that was the discovery that the further the object was away from us, the faster it was receding. And that's kind of what would happen with the balloon expanding outward. And so that was a pretty mind-blowing discovery, that the universe was expanding outward. But then the other part of that was the realization that if you back the history of the universe up in time, if we have an expanding universe in the forward direction of time, as you back it up in the reverse direction of time, the galaxies would have been at each progressive point in the finite past closer and closer and closer and closer together, until finally you would get to a point of convergence, past which you could no longer back extrapolate, because all of the matter of the galaxies, the energy of the galaxies, would have converged to that point in the finite past. And that would mark the beginning of the expansion, certainly, but also arguably the beginning of the universe itself. And so this was the first big indication that the universe itself had a beginning. And you may know from reading the book, Einstein himself didn't like this conclusion, even though in a separate track in his work in theoretical physics, his theory of general relativity implied the same thing, that the universe was dynamic and expanding outward in the forward direction of time. His theory of general relativity suggested that massive bodies actually curve the fabric of space, or what he called space-time. And if that were true, if gravity were the only force in the universe, then we should live in a kind of giant black hole universe where all of the mass of the universe had converged to a point and the space had wrapped around it so tightly that we would live in a black hole. But we don't. There is empty space between galaxies, between planetary bodies. So Einstein reasoned that there must be some contrary force pushing outward. He called that the cosmological constant. An outward pushing force implies an expansion from a beginning, but to circumvent that conclusion, he fiddled with his equations and the value of that cosmological constant to try to portray the universe as a kind of equipoised system that was balanced, where the gravitation and the inward pull of gravitation, the outward push were of the same magnitude, so they perfectly balanced. Turned out that that kind of a universe wasn't stable, and the evidence from observational astronomy showed that the universe actually was expanding. Einstein later confessed that his attempt to avoid the conclusion of the beginning was the greatest blunder of his scientific career. He eventually came around and realized that the universe was dynamic, it had a beginning, and then you had these two lines of evidence, observational astronomy, theoretical physics, converging on the conclusion of an ultimate beginning for our universe, suggesting that the universe was not eternal and self-existent, that to explain its origin required reference to some sort of external cause or creator beyond it.
And then you add to that the whole fine-tuning of the universe that you talk about for life.
Well, that's the second big discovery. And that comes a bit later, in the 1960s, 50s and 60s. The scientists, one of the first scientists working on that was interesting, also had a major reversal in his perspective. His name was Sir Fred Hoyle, British astrophysicist, Australian-British astrophysicist. He was initially deeply skeptical, and in fact remained skeptical about the Big Bang theory, the idea that the universe had a beginning. In fact, he named the theory the Big Bang. He gave it that name as a way of ridiculing the idea that the universe had a beginning. He didn't like the idea because he thought it smacked of the Christian doctrine of creation. And he was a staunch scientific materialist, atheist. But later he gave up his atheism after he discovered a number of these what are called fine-tuning parameters. We think of that universe expanding outward and being pushed outward by this force called the cosmological constant. Turns out that that cosmological constant is finely tuned to 1 part to the 90th power is an accepted value. That's an unimaginable degree of precision. And to get an idea of how improbable it is that the universe would have exactly the right value of the outward push, because the problem is if you get too much outward push, you get what scientists call a heat death, where all the matter and energy dissipates and everything gets too cold to sustain life. If there's not enough outward push, gravity takes over and sucks everything, pulls everything back together, and you get a big crunch. And we live in that black hole universe. Well, actually, no one lives in a black hole universe. Right. So you got to get things just right to allow for the possibility of life. And with that, just that one parameter, the odds are about 1 chance in 10 to the 90th power. Now, there are only 10 to the 80th elementary particles in the universe. And so to get the fine tuning right by chance would be roughly equivalent to putting a blindfolded person out into space, letting them float around in free space and hope that they would run into and point to one elementary particle out of all those particles in the universe, but not just in our universe. They would have to search 10 billion universes our size to make sure that they had a good chance of finding it. So that's the kind of improbability we're dealing with.
Right.
And then there are many other parameters like the strength of gravitational force, the strength of electromagnetism, the masses of the elementary particles themselves. They're not too heavy, not too weak. The forces are not too strong, not too weak, not too heavy, not too light, not too strong, not too weak. Some physicists say we live in a Goldilocks universe where all these things have been maximized to allow for the possibility of life. And Fred Hoyle eventually came around and concluded that, as he put it, a common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics and chemistry, and that there are no blind forces in nature to speak of. So he adopted a kind of proto-theistic view of the world. There must be fine-tuning suggests a fine-tuner, and that's the second big discovery. Yeah,
obviously, yeah. And I like the fact that you go through your book and you examine these 3 new discoveries through, looking through the worldviews of the materialist, the pantheist, the deist, and the theist, and to see which worldview helps better explain.
Yeah, exactly right. That's my project, if you will. And it's kind of what's that show, Survivor, where I did play a game of philosophical Survivor. Which of these great systems of thought can explain the whole range of evidence? A deism might explain the origin of the universe and the fine-tuning of the universe.
Explain that real quickly, which each one is, and because I'm not sure
Well,
the audience knows.
maybe we should talk about the third big discovery, and then we'll come
Okay.
back to those
Okay.
worldviews and show why I think theism provides the best overall explanation. But the third big discovery is the one we already alluded to, that inside living cells, you have this realm of digital information and information processing. And this was first discovered by Watson and Crick, 1953. They elucidate the structure of the DNA molecule. 4 or 5 years later, Francis Crick realizes that inside the beautiful double helix structure that we all learn about in high school biology for DNA, that this chemical subunits on the inside of the molecule are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or like zeros and ones in a section of software, which is to say, it's not their physical properties that give DNA the function that it has, it's their specific arrangement in accord with an independent symbol convention that we have now discerned called the genetic code. So there's a genetic text, a genetic message, if you will, genetic instructions, and a genetic code that gives the message meaning within the cell, that allows it to direct the construction of the proteins and protein machines that keep cells alive. So you have this fascinating realm of digital information technology inside living cells. In fact, recently, Richard Dawkins, the world's foremost scientific atheist, tweeted that he was knocked sideways by the exquisite precision of the data processing that was going on inside the cell moment by moment. And he then credited the scientists for, he said he was also equally impressed with the scientists who worked it all out. But the one thing he didn't comment on was, where did it come from?
Right.
What's the origin? And he's previously admitted that no one knows in the sciences how the first life arose with all that information via any undirected chemical evolutionary process. This is a complete mystery from the standpoint of evolutionary science. And yet, and here's the kicker, we do know of a cause that produces information. Right. Bill Gates has said that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. We know that software comes from programmers. We know that information generally, especially if we find it in a digital or alphabetic form, always comes from an intelligent source, whether we're talking about a computer program or a paragraph in a book or a hieroglyphic inscription or a section or information embedded in a radio signal. Information ultimately always comes from a mind, not a material process. So I've argued in Signature in the Cell, and then I reprise and update this argument in the new book, Return to the God Hypothesis, that the presence of that information in even the simplest living cells on Earth suggests the activity of a designing intelligence in the origin of life. And so that's the third big discovery. Where did the information come from? We have to account for that.
Right. And so you look at all these, you look at these three,
right?
You go through the various worldviews. Do you want to talk about that real quick?
Exactly. So I use a method of reasoning that's used in science and philosophy, known as the method of multiple competing hypotheses, or the method of inferring to the best explanation. So we want to ask, what we've got, the universe had a beginning, as best we can tell. The physical universe of matter, space, time, and energy had a beginning. The fine-tuning of the universe has been present since the beginning or soon after. And then we have the origin of this information that comes long after the beginning of the universe, when life first arises on planet Earth. How do we explain those three key pieces of evidence about biological and cosmological origins? What I do in the book is I look at different competing, what you might call metaphysical hypotheses or worldview hypotheses. Materialism as a worldview, which is the dominant and default way of thinking within much of the scientific world still today, though I think that's beginning to shift, I think fails to explain all three. If matter and energy are what begin to exist at the beginning of the universe, then you can't invoke prior matter and energy to explain the origin of that matter and energy, because prior to the origin of matter and energy, there is no matter and energy to do the causing. Instead, the kind of cause that we need to explain the origin of the physical universe itself with space, time, matter, and energy is an entity which transcends or is separate from matter, space, time, and energy, something that exists outside of our space and time and is neither and is not material. sound like any concept that you're familiar with. Remind you of anything. Many philosophers have suggested that God, the concept of God, precisely fits the causal profile. You have a powerful agent who exists outside of space and time, who is volitional, has choice, and therefore can initiate a change of state between nothing and something, between nothing and the universe. And is thought to be the concept of God entails the idea of creativity, a creator. And one of the great astrophysicists of the 20th century, Robert Dicke, has said that an infinitely old universe would relieve us of the necessity of explaining the origin of the universe, the matter and energy, at any finite time in the past. But if the universe isn't infinitely old, if it has a beginning, that suggests the need for an external creator. And so theism, insofar as it posits such an entity that exists outside of the creation, provides an adequate explanation for the origin of the universe, whereas materialism doesn't. Materialism affirms that the universe has been eternal and self-existent, and that's clearly not what we're finding from the evidence. Similarly, with the fine-tuning suggests a fine-tuner, but materialism denies the existence of it denies a pre-existent mind before the universe.
Well, I have to ask you this question before you
go
any
ahead.
further.
Yeah.
We're down to our last 53 seconds.
Oh,
and I have to ask you, can you hold over and do another one? Because I still have a couple more questions for you, and we can do a part 2.
Let's do a part 2, and then we'll be able to unpack the argument in its more full form.
Okay.
That's great.
So for those who are watching right now, we'll be back in just a moment. Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Wallace, President and co-founder of Freedom's Journal Institute for the study of faith and public policy. And I'm here today to tell you about a project that we're really excited about. It's called Racism in America and the Role of the Church.
We live in a time and day of conspiracy, a threat to the poor, a threat to the have-nots.
We're doing this series because we believe that the Black church needs to hear another voice. There's a voice out there that is secular. Society as well as the media are pushing the narrative that there's a resurgence in racism in America, especially with the rise of groups like Black Lives Matter and other protest groups. It's tearing the church apart. And I believe it's time for the church in general, and the African American church in particular, to have another voice that has a different point of view, a biblical worldview. I'd ask you to prayerfully consider making a donation to this project. Thank you. Welcome back. The psalmist says in Psalm 19, 1-3, quote, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard," end quote. Clearly, some people have not been listening. The psalmist is proclaiming in Psalm 19, 1-6, that God's glory is evident from the sky or heavens. The daytime light from the sun, quote, "pours out speech," end quote, and reveals knowledge in a vast cornucopia of stars at night. If one is paying attention, the evidence will point to the revelation that there is a creator. Creation screams that God exists. It is not a verbal declaration, but a subtle yet profound statement. Peter Craigie, in his World Biblical Commentary of Psalms 1-50, states that, quote, "To the sensitive, the heavenly praise of God's glory may be an overwhelming experience, whereas to the insensitive, sky is simply sky and stars are only stars. They point to nothing beyond," end quote. Thus, the wonder or interpretation is in the eye of the beholder. This is the case of the scientists who observe the cosmos but don't see a creator. They know the universe's complexity through biology, chemistry, astronomy, and the laws of nature, and yet reject the idea of an intelligent designer or God. They can't hear the chorus of nature declaring God's glory. They don't recognize his handiwork. And as Craigie says, they see, quote, "sky is sky and stars is simply stars," end quote. It's undirected creation by chance, matter, and energy with only an appearance of a design or designer. However, those who recognize the hand of a rational intelligence in creation, the founders of modern science, reason that if the one who designed nature also designed our rational mind, then nature must be intelligible. Dr. Meyer, in his monograph, The Return of the God Hypothesis, says, quote, "They, the scholars, insist that modern science was specifically inspired by the conviction that the universe is the product of a rational mind, who designed the universe to be understood, and who also designed the human mind to understand it," end quote. Yet postmodern scholars had moved away from the ideas of Newton, Galileo, Kepler, and Copernicus. Hawking, Dawkins, Hitchens, and most of the Academy have rejected and even ridiculed those who hold to an intelligent design cosmogony. However, with mounting evidence from number one, the acceptance that the universe had a beginning, number two, that the universe is fine-tuned for life, and number three, that there are periods of new biological information, lead one to conclude that an intelligent designer is a more logical explanation than random chance. With the new discovery, the heavens are again declaring God's glory, and scientists now have to reevaluate their discarding of the God hypothesis. In the second half of the psalm, the writer mentions the glory or revelation of God through his word, the Torah. He explains the benefit of that written revelation to the believer. It also shows that God is a personal God who gives instruction. Thus, God, the intelligent designer, reveals himself or communicates by natural revelation and by the written word. Some either receive that revelation while others reject it or are oblivious to it. Unfortunately, like the idols that the psalmist speaks about in Psalm 135, verses 15 through 17, many in academia and even in the church have ears that do not hear and eyes that do not see. They are blind and deaf to the revelation God has in his creation, and thus, if they can't understand the first part of the psalm, they won't get the second half. However, as Dr. Meyer has written, some may be gaining new insight as they study the mounting evidence they had once overlooked in the cosmos. Some scientists are beginning to see and to hear. Now let me return to the Psalm 19, verses 4 through 6, which says, quote, "Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them he has set a tent for the sun, which comes out like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them. There is nothing hid from its heat," declares the extent to which the glory of God is seen and declared. The personification of nature depicts the intelligent designer who also designed us to hear, see, and understand that he exists. The second half of the psalm will let us know that he has a design for our lives, that as he communicates through nature, he also speaks through instruction, the Torah. There is a plan and a purpose behind his creation. Why is this important? We'll see next time in part 2. Ladies and gentlemen, we are Kingdoms in Conflict.